In this video, we finally cross the Atlantic and we create the Old and New Worlds by bringing them together using the person of Columbus. More particularly though, I want to connect what happened in the past 800 or so years in Spain with what happens when Spanish conquistadors get to the New World. And I want to raise questions about how much we can know about events that happened over 500 years ago. And here's the plan, and we've got a lot to do in this video. One of the things I want to do is to pick up why 1492 was a significant year and how its significance is linked to events in Spain. I want to look at events in the New World and what is extraordinary about what happens once Europeans reach the New World of the Americas. And I want to pick up on the uncertainties of history, how we can't quite know what happened over 500 years ago. There are those key questions again. And here's the list of further reading in case you want to pursue any of these topics further. And here's the tie to those earlier videos on the Islamic world and the building of the Islamic empires and on the significance of Tamerlane and his empire. Medieval Europe was aware of the Islamic world and it was aware of its good stuff. While Europe didn't have a great deal to trade and to participate in those networks directly, it was aware of them and it could find some goods. Strangely, the launch of the Crusades in 1095 actually enhanced European connections with the Islamic world. We might think of warfare as being divisive, but looking at this map, you can see people from all over Europe heading to the end of the Silk Road's network. On the portion of the map on the right, you can see the Crusader states, where Europeans had a foothold in the Holy Land and were at the end of those networks, those trading networks. They could see the great things that went through them. And it's not just great things, it's also information and ideas. Scholars in the Islamic world valued their heritage from the Romans, from the Greeks. And medieval Europeans had new access to those ideas. They also had access to original ideas that came from parts of Asia. Among those ideas, the Hindu-Arabic system of numerals. I'm sure that you encountered Roman numerals. In school, we still see them around the place when organizations are trying to show off. But they're not very good to calculate with. It's this process of connection that brings that idea about how better to handle counting and enumeration through into Europe. So information, ideas, but also those nice goods. And Europe develops a taste for the things that are available through those Silk Road networks. And the Crusades had a definite effect on Europe, less of an effect in Asia and the Islamic world, but a definite effect on European knowledge of the good things that are out there within those trade networks that link through the Indian Ocean and through in Asia and through the Islamic world. And on this map, you can see those networks. And you can see that choke point at Constantinople, that the Byzantine Empire acted as a middleman between the Islamic world and Europe. You can see those sea routes coming in across the Black Sea. You can see those land routes stretching across Asia, stretching down through Arabia, stretching across North Africa, and drawing to that point in Constantinople. Once they're through there, they flow through the Mediterranean fringe. They flow particularly through the Italian trading cities of Venice and Genoa, and they flow into the rest of Europe. Well, flow might be too generous a term. They trickle into Europe. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 breaks that connection, and it cuts off supply of things that Europe has become rather fond of. I noted in a previous video that medieval Europe can be described and has been described as a pimple on the arse end of Asia. This choking off of supply explains why it might be better to think of Europe as a boil, and a boil that then explodes across the Atlantic, Why is it Europe that sets off across the Atlantic? Well, Europe sets off across the Atlantic to try and get around the Islamic Empire and to get to the original source of the good stuff, China and the Spice Islands. And it has to do that because in 1453, its link to those trading networks is severed with the fall of Constantinople. I've mentioned the Crusades. There was friction between the Islamic world and Christian Europe. And there were a couple of places where that friction was visible. It was visible in the Crusades and in that European determination to reclaim sites in the Holy Land which were important to Europeans, but also important to a whole lot of other people and people who actually lived there. There's also a point of friction in Spain. Remember the map of the Islamic world and that Spain and Portugal fell firmly within it for a long period of time. They fell firmly within it for nearly 800 years, although, as you can see on these maps, there was a slow process of reconquest, and I've put reconquest in inverted commas because Christian Europe's claimed parts of the Iberian Peninsula that it hadn't held for 800 years isn't as natural as medieval Europeans might have liked to think. The geographical boundary of the Pyrenees meant there was some sense to the Iberian Peninsula falling within the Islamic world, but that sense was undermined by the religious sense of Europeans and the significance of the tomb of St. James in Santiago in northern Spain, which tied this portion of the world to Europe. And you can see that on this map of pilgrimage routes. Europeans travelled to Santiago de Compostela to visit the tomb of St. James, and there was a network across Europe of people who travelled. Pilgrimage was an important part of medieval Christianity. These particular routes, particularly the ones within Spain itself, are still important, and people go and walk these routes in the present. In the medieval period, this served to tie the Iberian Peninsula to the rest of Europe, and many people went. In the 13th century, so admittedly 100 years, approximately 35,000 pilgrims travelled from Paris to Santiago de Compostela, from one city, thousands across a century, but from one portion of Europe. There were an awful lot more pilgrims setting out from other parts as well. And this pilgrimage route was important. Again, it's a network, ideas flow, there are art forms that develop along this way. But what's also important is that there's that war occurring, that reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula by Christian forces. And that the Pope, who's also encouraging military activities in the Holy Land as part of the Crusades, recognizes that going and fighting against the infidel, so from the point of view of medieval Europe, the same enemy, although from the point of view of the Islamic world, a distinct political structure. But from the point of view of medieval Christendom, it's the same foe. There are Muslims in Spain, they should be pushed out of Europe, and doing so brings spiritual benefits because the Pope says it does. And so Christian forces press down over a period of nearly 800 years. They conquer the Iberian Peninsula, and in 1492 the last Muslim kingdom falls, and that's the Kingdom of Granada. One of the peculiarities of this process is the participation of St. James. Here's an image of Santiago Matamoros, St. James, the Moor Slayer. He appeared regularly during this process of holy war on the Iberian Peninsula, and despite having been a peaceful man during his life, after death and after having his remains transported to Spain, he got a horse, he got a sword, and he set about trampling the infidel. And I draw your attention to this. The image itself is an interesting one. You can see that clear identification of what Muslim people look like, but in the caption you can see where this was produced. These ideas that spread with the Spanish as they go to other places. And this is an experience that they take with them. 800 years of unpeace. 800 years where, as a group of people, they've been engaged in violent conflict with people who they identify as other and foreign. And 1492, the fall of the Kingdom of Granada, is when Columbus is successful in his application for funding to the Spanish monarchs. He's been turned down elsewhere. He's been turned down in Italy. He is originally from Genoa. And he's been turned down not because people are afraid he's going to fall off the edge of the planet, not because they don't think it might be possible to get to Asia by going west, but because they can recognize that his maths is bad. And he's underestimated the distance that he would need to travel to get to where he wants to go. In the euphoria of the final conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, small matters of mathematics are overlooked. And that euphoria of conquest and the significance of the reconquest and what happens in the Americas can be detected in this list as well. St. James appeared in battle during the reconquest. He also appeared in battle during the conquest of the Americas. I don't know what's happening when people see St. James in battle. Just as with discussions of Islam and the Islamic world, I wanted to be respectful of people's beliefs and their religious beliefs. Here, I want to be respectful of the religious beliefs of medieval Christians and admit that I have no idea what was happening when people saw Santiago and when they saw him participate in battle. For me, it's enough to know that people saw him or thought they saw him, and that there are those connections between that violent period of unrest on the Iberian Peninsula and what happens just afterwards in the Americas. And what happens when Columbus gets his funding and crosses the Atlantic is extraordinary. I've included a quote rather than an image on the slide because Ronald Wright sums it up rather nicely. He sums up the strangeness of this moment where we get to having an old world, the world that is familiar and known to Europeans in 1492, and a new world, a place that is unexpected, not reported in the Bible, and shouldn't exist. And it takes a little while for the new world to exist. In 1492, Columbus is convinced that he has done what he set out to do and reached Asia. He makes 4 more voyages in his lifetime, and it's probable that on every one of them, he thought he was sailing to Asia, that he did not recognize the extraordinary events that he was part of. He also made a further return voyage after his death, where his bones were carted to the New World, remained there for some time, and later returned to Europe. But that's neither here nor there. Columbus didn't have the vision to realize what he was part of, and he had a clear agenda, and his clear agenda was to make a profit. He was going to make a profit by finding a route that got Europe direct to the riches of Asia. When that didn't quite happen, he set about finding other ways to make money. I've said he made 4 return voyages while he was living. He kept on coming back. He kept on pushing for his investment to pay off. At first, having reached Asia as he thought he was going to make his profit by trade. That didn't work out. He couldn't find the goods he was looking for. Then he thought he was going to make the profit directly by returning with large amounts of gold. That didn't work out. Then he thought he was going to make money by bringing back enslaved people. And again, that didn't work out. Columbus struggled and he performed in various ways about how he'd been mistreated by the Spanish crown. But these were his motives. And the motives of Columbus and the Spaniards who came in force afterwards were mixed. Some of them were more at the adventurer looking for money end of the spectrum. Some of them had religious motives as well. It's like the notion of the Crusades and of jihad. There's a mix of material, worldly benefits to going and fighting a group of people who you can identify as an acceptable enemy and confiscating themselves in the form of slaves or their goods. But there are spiritual benefits as well, as the Pope had promised when he promoted crusade and when he promoted participation in the reconquest. There are mixed motives, but the people who come are coming from Spain, from that period of nearly 800 years of unpeace and of war against non-Christians. And when they arrive, there are extraordinary events which set the pattern of what Europeans expect when they form empires. I hope you've heard of Cortes and that you associate him with the conquest of the Mexican Empire. He was a half-trained lawyer. He was an unlicensed adventurer who really needed to make money and get it to the Spanish crown in order not to stand trial for operating outside the law. And he landed on the American mainland. Remember, the Spanish had been on Hispaniola, on that large island in the Caribbean. Cortes marks the moment when they expand their operations to the mainland, and they expand their operations because they're hearing about rich empires that lie further inland and that carry the potential for profit. So he lands there 22nd of April, 1519. He reaches Tenochtitlan, now Mexico City, the capital of the Aztec Empire, on the 8th of November, 1519, where he's welcomed. He hears that people are coming from the coast to take him back to make him accountable for operating outside the law. He needs to leave. His men misbehave. They get kicked out of Mexico City. And so there's a 93-day siege, which ends with the fall of Tenochtitlan and Cortes entering a city which is starving and dying from smallpox. And it's an extraordinary story when you tell it that way. Cortes starts as an unlicensed adventurer with 450 soldiers, and he only has that many because the ships that take him to the coast get scuttled, and he turns the sailors into soldiers as well. And with this force, 450 people, he takes on an empire of 12 million people, and he comes out triumphant. And that sounds a little bit suspicious. We'll come back to it. He's one of 3 great stories of massively successful empire building by Europeans. The second occurs in Peru with Francisco Pizarro and his half-brothers taking on the Incan Empire. He starts in an even worse position than Cortes, and again he's operating at the margins of Spanish authority, and he needs to be successful. He sets off with 180 soldiers, which is reinforced to 600, and he takes on an empire of about 9 million people, and he's triumphant. He takes the Inca, the god emperor, hostage. Once the ransom has been produced, he still executes him. And on the 15th of November, 1533, he enters the Incan capital of Cusco as a triumphant conqueror. How could this happen? Not once, but twice in the New World. And this is where I get to that promised point where I suggest historians don't know it all. There have been many theories. In the heyday of empire, it was tempting for Europeans to believe that the reason that Cortes and Pizarro were successful was that they were that good, that Europeans just had something that other groups of people lacked. And that plays through even in later interpretations of what on earth happened. But I think this explanation is fortunately out of fashion, and we need to dig a little bit deeper. One of the other explanations about how these small forces of Europeans were able to conquer large empires was that they weren't actually small forces of Europeans. Amerindians are important in the fall of both empires. Amerindians were important particularly in the fall of the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire had networks of trade, as I mentioned in a previous video, and one of the things they demanded as tribute was human beings so that they could be taken and have their hearts cut out while still living in order to keep the sun shining. Groups who were not Aztecs and who had to produce this tribute were not entirely happy about it, and when an opportunity presented itself to link forces with outsiders and to topple the Aztec Empire, they took it. Most of the people involved in the conquest of Mexico were Amerindian. They were native allies, and one of the really important people involved in this process was Marina. You can see her here in this image, who acted as an interpreter and consort to Cortes. She spoke the language of the interior and the language of the coast because she had been sold as a slave. Cortes had a soldier who spoke Spanish and the language of the coast, and Marina learnt Spanish and was able to act as a translator for Cortes through the later process of the conquest. She was able to act as an intermediary with indigenous groups who were unhappy with Aztec rule, and there's this argument that the key point of this conquest was not the participation of Europeans, but the actions of the native allies. The problem with this explanation, though, is that Mexico suddenly becomes a Spanish possession. The native allies don't use Cortes to their own ends and then end him. Instead, it is the Spanish who take control, not just of the Aztecs, but of the lands of the native allies themselves. One of the other explanations put forward for Spanish victory is technology and the role of technology in combat, that the Spanish came with firearms and more sophisticated metalworking, and they built particular types of European-style boats that gave them an advantage in the siege of Tenochtitlan, which is built in the middle of a lake. And they had horses, and horses are extraordinary military technology. Think about a man on horseback versus a man on foot. That's increased mobility and increased force when it comes to the use of a weapon and striking down. But there are problems with this explanation as well. Aztec warriors wanted to win, and they adapted. At first, horses look extraordinary and invincible. This is an image of a skull rack where Aztecs displayed the heads of their fallen enemies. The Spanish are there, and so are the horses they rode in on. Aztecs learnt to fight against European technology, and most of the forces they were fighting against didn't have European technology because they were the native allies. There were only so many arquebuses and horses available to Cortes and his men. They might have had experience of siege warfare, but during the process of the conquest, Spanish armour tended to be abandoned for local-style padding, and the native allies used their familiar weapons. I've mentioned the significance of the Aztecs and their need to keep the sun burning. There was a certain degree of fatalism in the Aztec worldview, and they held the view that the end of the world was coming, that there was going to be a return from the east of Quetzalcoatl. Possibly the dates aligned with Cortez's arrival, and there are stories that Moctezuma greeted Cortes as the returning god, and that the Aztecs, as they fought the Spanish, weren't really in a position to fight well because they were paralyzed by the sense that this was preordained, that their world was ending, and that the Spanish were divine. Associated with this, perhaps, is the idea that the Aztecs, in battle, tended to look to take captives rather than to kill outright on the battlefield. The idea being that you captured the enemy and then took them somewhere and cut out their heart. And so for the Spaniards captured on the battlefield could be reclaimed, whereas had they been killed, they would have been lost to Spanish forces forever. This idea came back into fashion in the 1980s in the work of Tvedt van Todorov. But fortunately, I think the idea that the Aztec worldview doomed them has fallen out of fashion again, because there was fierce resistance, and because the accounts of the Aztec greeting Cortes as returning god were written afterwards. The accounts of the omens and of this clear vision of what was going to happen, which supposedly paralyzed the Aztecs, is reported not at the time it occurs, but in accounts that are written after the conquest by Aztec people, but written after the conquest to explain events that have already taken place. The explanation for the conquest that I'm most invested in is the role of European diseases. When Cortes got into Mexico City, the people there were starving and they were dying from disease. In the next video, we'll explore why it was that European diseases had such an intense impact in the Americas, and why it was that historians didn't really notice that intense impact until the 1960s. But from the 1960s, this has been one of the explanations put forward, that it wasn't really the Spanish who conquered the Aztecs, it was smallpox. And it makes sense. Suffering from a massive pandemic and fighting a war is difficult. But there are problems with this explanation as well. And the problem with this explanation is that the native allies were even more exposed to the Spanish. They had closer communication, and the diseases should have hit them earlier and harder than they hit the Aztec enemy. All sorts of things happened as the Spanish got to the Americas. And as the New World, from the point of view of the Europeans, of course for the Aztec, Incas, and other peoples of the Americas, that was the world. But for the Europeans, as this New World swam into view, all sorts of things started to happen. In the next video, we'll come to the Columbian Exchange, which for me is at the heart of the subject. But here it's worth thinking about why it's possible to have different explanations of why the conquest of these two massive empires by Europeans was successful and what we can't know about the past.